Well, for this introductory tour of Michael's exhibition here, I've just selected a number of works which represent many of the aspects, or encapsulate many of the aspects of Michael's work. So I'm just going to have a look at each one of those groups, approximately 5 different groups, and then we will look at each work in more detail. And the first one that I'd like to talk with you about is one of the larger works in the exhibition entitled The Three Sisters. And while initially this looks like a very grand landscape, very much in the 19th century, early 20th century style of rural Australian landscapes, we very much need to look a little bit deeper beyond the surface imagery that's in Michael's paintings to the meanings behind the paintings and the messages that he is talking about. And a lot of those messages deal very much with the animals in the environment themselves, and very much asking questions about what their future is and what our interrelationship and cohabitation prospects are for the future of those varied species. And in this one we have very much a typical of a slightly open, scattered Tasmanian landscape. As I said, initially looking very benign, but when you start to look closer, and this is something you really have to do with Michael's paintings, and the extraordinary rich complexity of detail and colour and the various nuances of such really do invite you in to look closely at that detail. And what look, for example, here like rather harmless little clumps of yellow shrubs are actually the introduced and very invasive species of European gorse, which throughout Tasmania in cleared forests, cleared farming lands, and also now through forests as well, you can see that species. And sitting amongst that are the subjects of the title of the painting. These 3 wallabies that seem almost caught by surprise. So while we're looking at the painting, we're also looking at them. So we're in a sense very much a voyeur. We're catching them at a moment when they're in their environment. And they've left the cover and shelter of the denser bush, the denser shrubbery, for a moment outside grazing. And the expressions on each of their faces are very individual. And so they're very much acknowledging the fact that Michael has an extraordinary ability at observation of animals, and that observation is as a result of having studied and known and looked at those animals to understand their behaviour, their poses in the natural environment, but as we shall see later, also within a rather incongruous urban environment. And so one can actually look at the very intricate detail in these works, but also at the broader landscape that is actually encapsulated. What Michael doesn't always do is particularly capture a specific landscape, but rather takes aspects of the landscape and modifies them according to his composition. And this is the case with this work here. And the lake in the background is based on McRae's Hill, where in the tiers, where he has modified it to actually fit the particular composition of this work. And so we have that sense of the distance, the hills fading out, and this very, very dense, almost solid coverage of vegetation, which is very typical of the many folds and layers of hills that you get within the Tasmanian landscape. And so in contrast, we have a much more introspective view, a much more enclosed view of the forest. And this one is called Rainforest Dancer, with the delightful figure here on a not untypical pose in movement, but within this extraordinary lushness of the green of the deep, quiet gullies of the rainforest. You have the sensation through the multicoloured flecking of the leaves, of the semi-cleared forest floor, and extraordinary detail and absolute lushness of these wet, temperate rainforest gullies. Almost in some ways primeval, with the tree ferns here, the dead leaves, fronds hanging down, and it's quite extraordinary sometimes to be walking through the forest and to come into a place like this, which in many ways is a discovery of something perhaps secret, perhaps spiritual, perhaps sacred, within the vaster expanse of the forest. And you could see for smaller animals that these spaces could be at once be a haven, somewhere to just be out of the forest, but also that very openness carries with it a sense of danger and exposure. And this is something really quite interesting within Michael's works, that you can look at them as a landscape, as the depiction of this extraordinary detail in the forest. And with detail, again, you get this extraordinary, often using sponges, but extraordinary fine brushes as well, all painted in acrylic on linen. You get this extraordinary sense of depth and layering and light. And it's interesting to look at the contrast of the light in the forest. We get a sense of it filtering through, that light softened by the lushness. In looking at this, it, for me, brings back a lot of sensory memories of being in forests like this. But also there's always something lurking, because in Michael's work there's often an element that you really have to look at closely to discover. And here we have the thylacine, just peeking out, and very much a presence there. Benign, who knows? Casual observer, we don't know. But so it leads you to sort of question the sort of elements of Michael's work. The next three works that we're going to look at are quite a contrast from the first two. One, the colours and tones are much brighter, much more intense. Secondly, they move away from the natural environment into aspects of the urban environment. And this is the rural, urban, natural environment is really the third of the three sort of key elements in Michael's work that come regularly into his paintings. The first one is entitled Lost in the Orient. And in many ways this work draws on Michael's love of antiques and his knowledge, but also drawing on the richness of colours and patterns of the various 18th and 19th century painted china. And we can see again, you have to look closely, the little wallaby in here, and the remnants of a forest tree, and this extraordinarily beautifully detailed tapestry. And again, there are little surprises. The bee, for example, the blue stork-like birds here. Again, another bee. And this is where, as I said before, looking closely and taking time to look really brings great rewards in looking at the paintings. Mickey and Friends, on the other hand, takes us into a much more contemporary world. And when you look at all the figures and the sideshow setting, it reminds us perhaps of those games played at country shows, at rural shows, at touring fairs and things like that. And the phrase, "every child wins a prize," immediately comes to my mind, and with my own memories of various shows. And here, again, you have to look for the wallaby, but there is just peeking out here amongst all this riot of glorious colour and detail is our wallaby. And there will always be one in each of these paintings. So again, looking. We move even further into the man-made environment with this one entitled "In the Rag Bag," where our wallaby almost seems superfluous to this extraordinarily rich folded bag of, or composition of fragments, discarded clothing, discarded household items. And it's very much a commentary on our consumption of products and their impact on the native animals. And that sense of competition for resources and allowing space for them to survive within a natural environment. Again, quite a departure in each of these three paintings, quite different subject matter, but moving from historical works and references in the first one, in the Orient, right through to a very contemporary statement, as I mentioned before. We jump to this very small jewel-like painting of a wallaby as the centrepiece of a very beautifully detailed 19th century gold brooch, broadly of the genre known as Goldfields jewellery, but part of that exquisite group of works of by Australian jewellers that used endemic plants and animals to capture that very essence of what it was to be Australian and what was recognised as Australian in the 19th century. And if you pan in very closely to the works, you can see the flowers, beautiful, the wrought suspended pearls here, and the wallaby holding the diamond. And I just think, what an exquisite thing if it was a real brooch and one could actually wear it. It's something you could really rather lust after. So we'll take it out of the painting and put it on our jackets, and it would be an absolutely superb work. But it's interesting that Michael has chosen to do the wallaby, because the kangaroo as a generic species very much came to, rather unofficially until 1908 when it appeared on the official coat of arms, to represent Australia and Australianness, from becoming a unique curiosity in the paintings of George Stubbs from the specimens brought back by Sir Joseph Banks. The kangaroo then appeared in all sorts of paintings as a design motif in the decorative arts, in architecture, right through to the contemporary era, when who doesn't recognise the symbol on the tail of our Qantas planes, the flying kangaroo. It's a classic and identifies very, very clearly with Australia.